China is moving sand by the billion tons and planting trees by the billion stems. Entire deserts that once marched toward Beijing are now held in place by man-made forests, solar fields, and irrigation lines that run like veins across dunes. At the same time, lakes are collapsing, riverbeds are being mined bare, and new highways cut straight through land once considered lethal. This is the story of how a country tried to stop the desert from swallowing it and what it cost to do it. A country turning to sand. Before the glass towers and high-speed rail lines, northern China was a belt of grassland and scattered woodland. Goats and sheep grazed under poplar windbreaks, rivers ran seasonally but predictably, and villages sat on soil that could still hold moisture. That balance is gone. Over the past 70 years, the north and northwest have watched usable land turn step by step into bare dust. Today, roughly 1/4 of the country's territory is classified as desert or severely degraded dry land. The line between green and yellow is not a natural frontier. It is a slow-moving disaster pushed forward by people. The forces behind that shift are simple to name and hard to reverse. Industry moved into dry provinces and pulled groundwater faster than rain could replace it. Farms expanded to feed growing cities and stripped topsoil that took centuries to build. Forests that once anchored dunes were cut for fuel or cleared for cropland. Herds grazed every sprout that tried to come back. With less cover, wind lifted the loose sand and carried it east. Dust began to travel far the empty basins where it formed. Sandstorms that once stayed in Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia started to sweep across Gansu, Ningxia, and Hebei. On bad spring days, a yellow haze rolled straight into Beijing, scratching throats, stinging eyes, and grinding into windowsills and subway seats. The scale is hard to picture until you follow the numbers. Desertified land in China now measures in the millions of square kilometers, an area larger than many nations. In the late 20th century, the Gobi Desert alone was advancing by several thousand square miles per year. The Yellow River, which for centuries carried the legend of feeding the heart of the country, began to run so low that long stretches went dry for months. Grassland counties lost their grazing base. Villages abandoned fields that no longer held water. When a dry field finally lets go, it does not slowly fade. It becomes airborne and leaves. By the late 1970s, the crisis could no longer be ignored. Airborne dust was hitting Seoul and Tokyo. Commercial flights diverted to avoid sand clouds as thick as smoke. City officials in Beijing sometimes had to turn on street lamps at midday because the sun was muted to a pale disk. Leaders faced a basic question: either retreat from the north or hold the line. Retreat was not acceptable, which left only one option: stop the desert where it stood. That decision sent China down a path no other nation had attempted at continental scale. Instead of building walls of stone, the plan was to build a wall of life, wrap shifting dunes in roots, and force sand to sit still. It would take billions of seedlings, thousands of irrigation wells, and entire new careers for people who once herded goats. It would also take sand, and a lot of it. If the desert was already swallowing villages and sending sand into Beijing, how do you even begin to stop it, and can you really turn shifting dunes into something that holds still? The Great Green Wall. In 1978, Beijing authorized what is now called the Great Green Wall. On paper, it looked almost impossible. A belt of forest and shrubland would be planted across the north and northwest, stretching in patchwork zones from the edge of the Gobi toward the industrial heartland. The goal was blunt: slow the dunes, trap blowing sand, and give exhausted soil a chance to recover. It sounded like a myth. It became policy. The early years were closer to survival engineering than gardening. Crews tried to plant young trees directly in open sand and watched the wind bury them overnight. Summer heat climbed past 40 Celsius. Winter dropped below -40. Rain might not fall for months. Normal saplings had no chance. Forestry teams and local farmers began to experiment. They dug funnel-shaped pits so dawn condensation would collect at the base of a seedling. They wrapped root balls in water-retaining fabric and buried slow-release irrigation bags below the surface so moisture would not evaporate. They chose species that could live where most trees cannot. Saxaul, desert willow, poplar lines bred for brutal dryness. Some of these trees drive roots 60 to 90 feet down to tap groundwater far below reach of grass. Over time, the method shifted from scattered groves to deliberate geometry. Workers planted in tight grids to break the wind and force dunes to stall. Straw checkerboards were hammered into sand to hold it still until roots could take over. Local families were paid to patrol, water, and replace dead stems before the dune could reopen. What began as a state order turned into generational labor. In Inner Mongolia and Ningxia, couples spent decades walking the same square kilometers with buckets, shovels, and rolls of straw. Some can now point to entire shelter belts that did not exist when they were young and say those are ours. By the 2000s, satellite images began to show something few experts had predicted. Patches that were once mobile dune fields had darkened. What had been bright tan in the 1980s showed up as muted brown and early green. According to government tallies, artificial forest and shrub cover now span an area larger than many countries. This living barrier does more than block sand. Trees lock carbon in their trunks and in the soil around them. Surface temperatures drop in their shade. Moisture lingers a little longer in air that used to strip skin dry. Villages that once watched crops fail under abrasive wind now grow millet, sunflowers, and even fruit in places that were bare gravel 2 generations ago. A plan that once sounded like propaganda is now daily life for millions. Yet success brings tension. Trees in dry land drink water. Irrigation lines and wells must keep feeding them if rainfall cannot. That means the Great Green Wall is not a single build. It is a living machine that must be kept running year after year across almost 200,000 square miles. Planting forests to freeze a desert in place is one thing on paper, but what happens when the war against sand moves into the most hostile zone on Earth, where even standing still can kill you? Highways through the Sea of Death. Far to the west lies the Taklamakan, a desert locals call the Sea of Death. It covers more than 300,000 square kilometers, most of it shifting dune with almost no natural anchor. In the early 2000s, spring storms from the Taklamakan could swallow highways, choke airfields, and darken entire prefectures in Xinjiang. Cropland downwind was stripped to gravel. Oil fields and gas wells inside the basin were cut off for days. The state answer was familiar in ambition. Do not go around the desert. Cross it. The Taklamakan Desert Highway began as an industrial service road in the 1990s and grew into a full transport artery. Asphalt now runs straight across dunes that once behaved like water. On both shoulders, shelter belts line the route, row after row of drought-tolerant shrubs and hardy poplars planted in trenches. Under the sand, a web of drip irrigation pipes and shallow wells feeds those belts day and night. Crews work in rotation to clear drifts and repair torn lines before wind can reclaim the road. Stations sit at regular intervals with pumps, solar panels, storage tanks, and dorms so workers can live on site. The idea is plain. Keep the routes alive and the road survives. The same logic extends to rail. The Luntai to Houghton line, sometimes called a steel lifeline, threads across land where no paved road existed before it. Nearly 90% of its length runs through sand-prone zones. Engineers elevated long stretches on causeways and built more than 1,000 culverts so wind-pushed dunes could pass below rather than climb over the track. Windbreak strips flank the rails. Mesh mats pin loose slopes. 9 sand control centers monitor conditions and dispatch crews to shovel, spray, and anchor. Trains now carry oil, grain, building supplies, and people. What was once an isolated interior basin links directly to markets and ports. These crossings are not only feats of civil engineering. They are declarations. The message is that even the most hostile land inside the national border will not remain empty. Roads invite settlement, and settlement demands stability. Along the Taklamakan Highway, service posts that began as pump stations now sell fuel and basic goods. Some have grown into towns with schools and clinics. Tree belts planted only to hold sand now double as sources of leaves, wood, and animal fodder. Families harvest branches for fire-resistant timber and gather herbal material from shrubs that would never have grown there without irrigation. To keep a highway alive in a moving dune field, you need constant labor and constant water. Irrigation wells pull groundwater. Solar arrays line service yards so pumps and sensors can run without diesel. Officials present the route as a near-carbon-neutral desert highway, with photovoltaic stations replacing the fuel that used to run maintenance gear. Whether that claim stands up to a strict audit is debated. The intent is not. The Taklamakan is treated as territory to be held, farmed, traveled, and powered, not an empty gap on the map. Highways and rail lines now cross the Sea of Death, and oil and people move where only dunes moved before, but what new price did that access unlock beneath the surface? The cost of sand. There is an uncomfortable contradiction under all this greening. The same country that is planting forests to stop erosion is also pulling staggering volumes of sand out of its rivers and lakes to feed construction. Desert sand will not work for concrete. Its grains are too round and smooth, shaped by endless wind. Concrete needs sharp edges that lock together. Those grains come from river beds. China builds more housing, factories, ports, and highways than any other nation on Earth. That appetite swallows billions of tons of sand every year. When you pull too much sand from a river, the channel deepens. When you gouge out a lake bed, the shoreline drops. The most dramatic case sits in Jiangxi province at Lake Poyang, the country's largest freshwater lake. In the wet season, Poyang once spread across thousands of square kilometers and acted as a natural buffer for the Yangtze. It stored floodwater in summer and leaked it back downstream in winter. That rhythm protected farms and towns from violent swings. Then commercial dredging ramped up. Hundreds of boats, some the size of small ships, began scooping sand off the lake floor and pumping it into barges. On peak days, an individual vessel can lift thousands of tons. Multiply that by a fleet and the lake bed drops fast. The change is visible from the air. Shoals that used to sit just below the surface are now trenches. Wetland shallows where migratory birds once fed have turned to cracked mud flats.